Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Kelly. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion.
Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Kelly. How's it going?
How's it going?
It's good. It's good. We're just kind of wrapping things up around here to head into the holidays. So, how about you?
Yeah. Trying to stay out of stores as much as I can. And I'm actually kind of ahead of the game. I've actually wrapped almost all the presents, which and the fact that I'm not going to have to go out on Christmas Eve is I'm feeling like a winner right now.
You are, because that's probably my future. So we'll see.
Yeah. Sorry, that's what retirement gets me. I don't have to go out on Christmas Eve, so
Yep.
A little bit more time. So I'm super excited about our conversation today and our guest.
Yes, we have Liz Charlotte Grant joining us today. Liz is an award-winning nonfiction writer. She's based out of Colorado, and she is about to publish her first book, Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. Liz has also published in outlets such as the Huffington Post, Religion News Service, The Revealer, Hippocampus Magazine, Brevity, Sojourners, The Christian Century. It's a very long resume. I was on Liz's website, and I was very impressed. You are a prolific producer of content, and also have a Substack called The Empathy List. So our listeners should definitely check out her work there. So Liz, welcome to Atheist.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you. So, Liz, first of all, we've kind of lived a little bit of we've had a parallel journey in our path from Wheaton College to deconstruction. So, and you had asked me before we got on air here how I feel about Wheaton now. I'm going to push that at you first.
Make me answer first. I see how that is.
Yeah.
I would say I feel grateful for my time overall. I was very depressed while I was at Wheaton.
Oy, not a good
College is hard.
At least, half of my time. But
man.
part of that was like being away from my dysfunctional family and coming to terms with the ways that I was deeply unhealthy as a human. So that it's hard for me to put that on Wheaton, but I would also say any sort of high achieving environment, you're gonna just have problems. Like people there will have problems with each other. And I'm super relational, like warm culture sort of human. And I did not jive very well with like the high achieving majority. So I was like, and I was hanging out with arty kids the whole time. So we were all depressed. I mean, we were a mess.
Did you hang out with any theater kids while you were there?
A little bit. Were you in workout?
I was a workout kid.
You were.
Yes.
I love that.
That's how I ended up there, because I went to visit one weekend and I was like, there's no way I'm going to a conservative Christian school. Like, no way. I'm going to college to drink beer. Like, what? Like, I was still there when we couldn't dance. We weren't allowed to dance.
We could swing dance, I think.
What? Seriously, you could?
Yeah.
Okay.
When I was there.
Yeah. There was a square dance, I think, on like orientation, right?
Yeah.
But then we snuck out and went to Medusa's down in Chicago.
How dare you?
I know, we broke the pledge all the time. But I went because I really fell in love with the theater teacher, and he was wonderful. And
the program is amazing. I mean, I still remember some of the theater productions I got to see.
Yeah.
just like a very intimate but very serious-minded theater company. So it's kind of hard. It's hard to imagine, I think, when you think about a conservative Christian school, but they were doing some really edgy things. I mean, I loved it. I was such a weird creative person, and I just thrived, in the environment with other creatives. Now, that said, I mean, we were all depressed and really struggling with our families of origin and blah, blah, blah,
Yes, all that.
Faith was a mess. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then after school, so then did you immediately move to Colorado, or is that where you're from originally? Okay.
I'm not from Colorado originally. I've actually lived a lot of places, including overseas. I have extended family in Colorado, and I knew that I did not want to go home and live with my parents. So I graduated in the midst of the first recession in like 2008. So I'm in my late 30s. So for me, it was like, there are no real job prospects. Like, there just was nothing for someone, especially with a creative writing degree who had no experience in anything. It was like the publishing industry was wrecked. Executives are going for the same jobs I'm going for, it's like, it's not going to work. So I needed to kind of land somewhere where I could, like with family, live in somebody's basement. And I just was like, I will not go back to my parents' home. But I had family in Colorado and moved into their basement across the hall from my grandmother, and woke up to Fox News all the time, most mornings, because she was obsessed. And even at the time, I was like, this is some weird shit. You should probably unplug.
When you just kind of feel like just the room,
it was like
thick with anxiety.
Bill O'Reilly, and who else was there? Hannity. I think she loved Sean Hannity. And several of those guys were just spouting conspiracy theories their entire show. And I would hear them and be like, Grandma, this is really not true. Do you know that? Like, I don't think it's healthy for you to be listening to this. Finally, I was like, okay, listen, you can watch it, but you just have to turn it down. Like, I cannot wake up to this every morning at 6 a.m., please.
Oh my gosh.
So would you say, in terms of your kind of deconstruction journey, did that start right away, or was there some kind of, what was the kind of the impetus for that for you? I mean, Christian college will make you deconstruct for sure.
I think what's so interesting about Wheaton is, like, I knew plenty of progressive people. There actually was a very wide range of belief at Wheaton, which I think is hard to see from the outside. The administration kind of puts up one front, but it really is. I mean, it was a very intellectual student body, and that just meant you had a huge variety of beliefs amongst the students, and then a huge variety of belief even among the faculty, although there have been shifts and versions of kind of purity cleanses, over years at Wheaton. But especially in the creative writing department, they kind of ignored us. Most of the artistic programs, they were like, well, you're not theology, so it's fine, unless you make some visible protest that we disagree with. Like, they're not going to see what they're teaching their students. And most of the students in my classes were probably edgier than me. Like, I had been like a youth group kid, grew up in like a Bill Hybels version of evangelicalism. But I didn't know the word evangelical until I showed up at Wheaton and was like, oh, this is a whole thing that I didn't know I was a part of. Just thought I was Christian.
Oh no, you have a whole brand of Christian.
So anyway, I think for me, it was like the openness of so many people about their actual beliefs. That was a big deal. I've always been a very empathetic person, and I think I I was willing to sort of hear them out. And then I took some spiritual formation classes at Wheaton that really shifted my perspective. Like, started reading Henry Nouwen, and then found out, oh, he's gay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do I believe that can be okay? It's like, yes. Anyway, but in that bubble, it's like reading things outside of mainstream evangelical publishing is a little edgy. So I think folks saw me like that. I didn't realize that because I was still trying very hard to be evangelical, but I think it started in college. I think therapy was a big impetus for me, like getting in therapy. I had my first panic attack in a professor's office, just this sweet English literature. Actually, Lundeen, if you know Roger Lundeen.
Yep. I do indeed.
Such a sweet man, and so inept at knowing what to do with me. Completely lost my breathing, control my breathing in his office. He was very sweet. But did not know what to do. So I think after I had my panic attack in his office, I started going to the counseling center, and I don't think they did much to help me except just to be present. And I just wept across, from this sweet woman who was getting her counseling degree. And so I tell folks, I feel like that's the first time I was pastored.
Oh, interesting.
After growing up in church, praying the prayer at age 4, going to summer camps, Mexico mission trips, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I feel like I was really pastored by those women. And so I think it was a lot of things, but I think having some of those threads continued to kind of come apart, like the sweater just came undone slowly over time. It wasn't really one big thing for me. I think it was just over time, I'm seeing all these inconsistencies, the incoherence within the structure itself. And I don't know. I've just become progressively more liberal the older I've gotten.
Sure.
So I'm like most parents' worst nightmare kind of situation.
Well, I came home after college, and my parents were pissed because they were like, Wheaton made you this flaming liberal. And I'm like, really? Okay. But I too went to therapy for the first time in that counseling office. That was my first therapy. And that was big. Yeah.
Why did they call you liberal? What did they see in you that was different? Was it like you had gay friends, or like?
No, because that was still, even at that time, I graduated in 92 from Wheaton. So that was still like not
there were some years to come still.
There were some years to come there. Well, I mean, certainly that wasn't at Wheaton, but just politically, because I mean, our teacher, Jim, was he had this huge poster of like Daniel Berrigan on his wall, like, and like I was reading Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen, all these people, right? And so they're
like, Catholics aren't Christian.
Right.
What are you doing?
I'm going to an Episcopal church, like, oh my God, liturgy, what? And that was radical. So, yeah.
So I'm curious about so you get out of college, you're across the hall from your grandma. And then, how did you chart your path as a writer? Like, what's that journey been like?
Yeah.
I studied creative writing, as I mentioned. I think I knew that, like, as soon as I took classes out of order. So you're supposed to take Creative Writing 101. I signed up for creative nonfiction. That was my first writing class. And that was, I think I had a sense in myself, like, this is my genre before I even took anything. Like, I just was like, I need to write this. And I think it was pretty clear to me from the beginning, like, I have not that I wasn't actually that talented. I don't think, I think I had a lot to learn. But I think I did have this like hunger to get better at writing.
Yeah.
And a hunger also to kind of learn and understand what really made good writing. And with creative nonfiction in particular, I think it just felt, I would have called it like a calling. You know, I see it as a vocation more than an occupation. And really always have. I mean, I think there's always been this kind of core where I've known like, this is the one thing I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I still don't make money per se. I've made some, but it's not really career money.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that, and I had a misconception about that, even going in kind of like, I can find whatever, I can get an editorial job or, those didn't exist for me when I got out of school. I was working 3 jobs. I was working retail at a toy store. I was working for an author answering her emails. And then I worked as like a communications assistant for a nonprofit. I mean, it was like, I'm making $800 a month at 3 jobs. It was just like,
yeah.
Wow, this isn't a career. What did I get myself into here? But I think I ended up marrying a visual artist. And I think for me, that was actually probably the more formative decision. One of the most formative decisions I've made, because he was so committed to his own craft. He sort of forced me into it, which was really annoying. But like, he wanted to be in his studio all the time. And I was like, we're supposed to hang out together. And I had all these attachment issues. So I was like, do you not like me? And he's like, no, I want to make art though. Like, so anyway, we worked through that, but he sort of like forced my hand a little bit. Like, it was like, he's like, you're a writer. Like, I'm bored. He's working. I'm like, maybe I'll do it some more. Fine.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's awesome. How did you meet your husband?
At a Bible study.
Yeah.
So
Flip your hair.
Hair flip. Yeah,
Hair
I'm a really
flip.
good evangelical. Yeah, we met sort of randomly. It was like I was set up with somebody else on a blind date. I happened to meet him during the blind date. And then this guy invited me to this Bible study he was going to. He didn't show up, but it happened to be at my now husband's house. So we became good friends through that.
You were stood up on a blind date at a Bible study?
Well, he met me first at a church service and brought all of his roommates to our blind date.
My gosh.
That didn't work out very well.
That is also so evangelical.
Yeah, that church service too was nicknamed the meat market.
Oh my
Oh
God.
my gosh.
Is it like a young adult church service?
Okay, so I have to ask this question because I know you also wrote an essay that went viral about Elizabeth Elliot and purity culture. So I work now as I'm a spiritual director. And one of the things that I have learned that I did not know prior to doing spiritual direction with people around your age is that like shit got worse after I left college.
It did, unfortunately.
It got, I was like, how could it get worse? But yeah, so I'm curious. Yeah. And so the women that I see that are in their like mid to late 30s, early 40s are just have so much trauma from that purity culture that was present when I was there, but was not like it was when you were there.
Yeah.
Can you talk to that at all about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a function of a lot of things. Like, I think our parents were those boomer generation Billy Graham folks. I'm sure yours are as well.
Oh, yeah.
But they might have just been like a little bit, maybe they weren't like brought up in it the same. I don't know what it was, because some of the folks that that I know, I think Focus on the Family played a role in that. So like the particular influence on families in the 80s and 90s who are raising their kids, they're influenced by Focus. I live like an hour and a half from Focus on the Family now and have some ties to that through family, which is pretty wild. It still is has a really kind of negative impact on people's lives still. But I think those teachings were really coming into the Christian mainstream probably in the late 80s, early 90s. And so a lot of folks my age are like being raised on these really harmful beliefs from Dobson. I also think, so Elizabeth Elliot, bringing her into this, it's like I remember.
And tell Aaron who Elizabeth Elliot is.
Yeah. Aaron, have you heard of her?
Oh, Kelly's talked a little bit about purity culture. And so I have a little bit of understanding about kind of what all that is, but I'm not familiar with her. No.
Yeah. She was like the queen of purity culture. Like she was like the heiress. So she came up in like the 50s and 60s, became famous because her husband was actually murdered during missionary work in Ecuador. So he and 5 other men, or maybe it was 5 of them total, they went out into the jungles of Ecuador. They were trying to reach this unreached people group, and they were murdered in that attempt. And it's kind of a wild story in lots of ways. Like, I don't think he had to have been murdered. Just kind of the way they went about it was not, I'll let you read about it and make your own decision. But she writes this memoir. The other widows kind of christened her their spokesperson, and she writes this memoir, which is like bestseller, like almost does better than Nixon's biography. Like, I mean, like that level of fame. Yeah. It just like skyrockets her. So she's being published by these big 5 publishers. She's represented by Robert Frost's literary agent and Madeleine L'Engle's agent. What? So she's just like at the forefront of literary culture even. And then she takes this really hard turn and remarries this conservative Presbyterian man who is a seminary professor. And basically from then on, she starts championing these very patriarchal roles. Like before that, she actually had this sort of, she had some interest in feminism. But after she marries, she views her role as sort of submitting even her ideas to her husband's. Yeah, basically she ends up writing all these books. She becomes like the person who's writing about purity and sexual purity and submission and, all these kind of harmful patriarchal ideals. And despite having not entirely lived them herself, she's like being invited all across the country, across the world to speak on these things. She ends up selling millions of books. I mean, millions. She ends up writing, I want to say 37 books. And really it was entirely around these topics. Like she just kind of got pigeonholed eventually. And unfortunately, so her second husband actually ended up dying after about 4 or 5 years of their marriage. He had cancer, very sad story. And then she's single for 10, 15 years, ends up remarrying a younger man who happens to be, I believe, a very unhealthy and abusive person. And so ends up, there's like narcissistic abuse, I think, where he's like checking her odometer to see where she's going. And he's telling her when to finish meetings with friends and who she can spend time with. And it's
not good.
Really bad. Yeah. So, but this was all private. Like no one knew this. And so as she's writing all these books about submission, she herself is undergoing domestic abuse. And so there's been kind of this, there's been a backlash. I mean, I've experienced some of that, but there were these 2 biographies written about her, and I wrote a review of them. and it was late. It was not timely. Like, I think it was like 6 or 8 months after they both had come out. But I read this book and started saw these passages where she's describing the abuse. This historian is describing the abuse Elizabeth Elliot experienced. And I went online to look, like, is any Christian organization talking about this? Like, why is no one talking about this? And I realized all the reviews skip over her last marriage, which is the longest part of her life. I mean, it's like 30 some years.
Wow.
And it's the entirety of her ministry doing this purity culture work.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And I was so deeply disturbed. I wrote this essay, writing about this with both kind of drawing from both biographies. I talked to one of the authors as well, the historians who had written this biography. And no one had known this, and it just sort of blew up. Like, people, and that to me spoke more about Elizabeth Elliot's dramatic influence on a particular culture and kind of generations of women, because what I was hearing over and over was like, we read her alongside the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we read her for family devotionals. Like, my parents gave me her book to read and inform how I dated.
Wow. 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 Fascinating. What's the title of the essay that you wrote?
Let's see. I might have to look it up, to be honest, because I almost never end up titling my essays when I write for somebody else.
Oh yeah, somebody else creates a title.
Yeah. Yep. Which is great.
Oh, here.
Elizabeth Elliot, flawed queen of purity culture and her manipulative third husband. Something like that. Is that right?
Disturbing third marriage.
There you go.
Okay, I'll have to check it out. That sounds fascinating. So I'm curious. I guess we should talk about the book also.
Yes.
Since we were like,
also,
it's fun to just talk about all the other things too.
I know. Well, I mean, it's all part of the journey, right? Like, you know. But yeah, tell us about, just knock at the sky. Tell us about the book and the idea for the book, and
it's coming out January 7th.
Yeah. That's right.
That's super exciting.
Super soon. I've been waiting a long time.
Yeah. When did you finish it?
It was accepted by the publisher last Christmas.
Okay.
So that's not a long time in book terms, like a year, but it just has there's been several rounds of that, right? Book publishing is just slow work. Slow rewards, slow work. You know, you just don't know kind of what will the culture be like when it comes out. Who knows? Like, who's going to be president? Who knows?
Who knows?
So yeah, the book is an interdisciplinary commentary on the book of Genesis, basically, but it's braided essays. I am a literary writer as best as I can be. And I also write about fine art, and I write about science, and I write about all sorts of other stories of origins, and kind of pair that alongside the stories of Genesis, which I find to be really interesting just in their own right, kind of apart from any spiritual meaning or relevancy that they would have for us today, like, you know, a direct application. I feel like they are a word from our ancestors to us, that have been passed down. Literally, people copied these words by hand over centuries to get this story to us. And so, you know, like we would study Beowulf or the Aeneid, like, I kind of viewed my task as more of a literary critic. I'm like, I'm not a theologian. You know, I am interested in theology, but I'm really a storyteller. So, like, how can I approach this very ancient story with a fresh perspective? So, yeah. Anyway, that's the book in a nutshell.
So it's a braided essay. So do you kind of are you kind of telling other stories alongside, and it's the kind of the juxtaposition of the Genesis with these other stories that can then reveal to us kind of new truths about Genesis.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So it says in your little press release, which I thought was very cool, the story of Hagar and Sarah and Abraham. And I wondered if you would kind of tell us about that, because I have a lot of thoughts about that story. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear. So writing the first part of this book was really easy for me because it felt really, really distant. Like it was, an ancient cosmology story, right? I'm like, that's fascinating. And I don't view it as my job to make sense of it. I'm just sort of receiving what's there, right? And then you have all these kind of accounts of first encounters, like first contacts with a deity. And that's also fascinating. When I got to the story of Abraham, I think it started to feel more loaded for me. Christians view Abraham as a founder of faith. We also don't acknowledge that he's the founder of Judaism and Islam either, but he is. But I think I started to kind of wrestle with these questions around institutional religion related to Abraham. And part of that is how commentators have responded to those passages. So, for example, the story of Abraham is that he hears sort of a voice from out of the blue that says, in the King James, the translation is "get thee out." And the idea is leave your homeland, leave everything you know, and follow me out into the desert. And then Abraham, supposedly he's never met this deity before, rolls up his rugs, takes his whole train of people into the desert and just walks, until God says stop, basically. And it's confusing, but then the story kind of gets worse. That's like the high point of the story, in my view. Because after that, then God has promised land, God has promised kind of legacy, children. He and his wife, Abraham and his wife, Sarah, are infertile. And God has promised to give a child to them. And through this child, then generations to follow. Well, the problem is that Sarah is not pregnant and still not pregnant. And continues to be not pregnant and to be infertile. And in fact, past the age of childbearing. And there's just sort of silence from God about this deity, about what it means and how they should respond. And so Sarah, kind of in the custom of the time, gives her slave girl to Abraham. He sleeps with her, impregnates her, and then they are going to take this child as their own, who will then bear their legacy. Well, that's not exactly what God told them to do. And so there's all this stuff that kind of comes up around that. For me, the question of Hagar is the slave girl, the enslaved girl who becomes impregnated by Abraham. The question of Hagar continues to sort of haunt the story of Abraham and the founding of, I believe, my religion. She is enslaved, first of all, which is a problem from our perspective, right? And then beyond that, I think what I found when I was reading commentaries to try to understand, I was reading midrashic stories, so from the ancient Jewish tradition of storytelling around the biblical stories. I did everything I could to sort of read these alternative narratives to try to understand what these stories really meant, aside from my white American evangelical upbringing. And so I'm reading all these other theologians and commentators, and what I'm finding in some of the most ancient commentaries, from the early church fathers on, is this sort of crisis management mode toward Abraham. So you kind of imagine Abraham like a mega church pastor who's fucked up, he's had some fall from grace, and it's messed up. He's had sex with somebody he shouldn't, right? Had an affair, got somebody pregnant, right? So then what do you make of the story, right? Like, this is the founder of the faith. So what do you make of the story, right? So these early commentators are like, well, poor Abraham had no choice. His wife just couldn't have a baby. How dare she? It was her problem. And by the way, she brought it up, so it's really her fault. Or they say, well, yeah, I mean, Abraham had to, but when he did have sex with Hagar, he wasn't lustful at all. I'm like, so he accomplished something that's never, ever been accomplished in the history of the world. Right. That's what you're telling me. Yeah, he didn't enjoy sex. So I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. So there just has been like all this strange conversation around it. And I was kind of trying to parse it. And, a lot of these commentators believed that Abraham was like a type. I don't know if you've heard of this way of interpreting the Bible, but it's sort of a typology. It's almost like an archetype. Mm-hmm. So if Abraham is the archetype of Jesus, the perfect human, then he kind of needs to be perfect too, or perfect-ish, to be worthy. And so there's kind of a sense of like, he can't have done anything wrong. Yeah. And I was getting all these kind of evangelical flashbacks, right? Like, I'm like, this is like the megachurch issue, right? This is Jerry Falwell. How are you going to deal with this transgression? It didn't really happen like that. It's fine. Whatever. You're kind of right. We're going to
stand up and applaud when they confess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I think that was a really hard portion of the book to write. Mm-hmm. Because it felt so, it just felt like spiritual gaslighting, some of these commentators. And so I was like, if this person was real, which we don't know for sure, but it's like Iron Age literature, right? So we kind of know, but not really for sure. And, the historicity questions, I just didn't even deal with. I was like, I don't care about that personally. Like, that's not why I read this book. So, but when you go beyond that and you say, is this what all institutional religion is? Like, is it this version of covering over and hiding and being afraid of the truth and of our fucked upness, frankly? Is that institutional religion? Because if that's it, I don't want it. Yeah. So I think there were a lot of those questions in there for me too. Like, what level of acceptance does God have? I still believe in God. I'm still a Christian, which is, some people might dispute that. Based on what I believe, they might decide it's not Christian enough. But I think, there is sort of this question of, what does God actually think of this? Mm-hmm. And I think that's an open question. Like, I think it's not actually entirely clear in the text. And that's actually very interesting to me. What I have found in my study is that God does deeply care and is on Hagar's side. But God still blesses this founder, and that still rubs me wrong. Like, I'm still angry about that. So anyway, I think the founder Abraham syndrome, I just think it continues to dog the church, it dogs Christianity, it dogs all institutional religion. I don't know if there's a way around it. Because the fact is, I think power and authority are inherently corrupting. I do not think that they are healthy for human beings. And I think probably inherently they are wicked, if I believe in a sort of wickedness. I'm not sure. So anyway, I have a lot of thoughts.
I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that's, that idea of the power, power corrupting, right? But power being inherently like evil, or that power, there's just no possibility. That's fascinating. So what do you think or do you find, even in Genesis, do you find a alternate path to that? Like, how do you...
Okay, so I've got a thought here. So, so I'm looking at just like some of the writing about the book, and looking at Genesis as a work of art is like the line that they use. And so we just we were talking to another author who when he was talking about, he's studied lots of different religious texts, and he's like, when I look at the Bible, I look at it as poetry, like that, has some wisdom in it, but that's a work of art. And then I was thinking about the power question here. And so I just started reading Yuval Harari's new book. The Nexus is the name of the book, but it's like the history of information, essentially. And so what he is talking about in the book is like that power is essentially like, information is not like truth seeking, essentially, is what he's saying. He's like, information isn't about truth seeking. It's essentially like, when it comes together, when you have multiple people who are believing like the same story, right? That's where like power is originating from that. And so he uses like this idea of like, there's, your objective reality. So like your mountains, your rivers, your lions, right? Your subjective reality, which is like my feelings, inside of me. But then there's this inner subjective reality, which is like a large enough group of people all believing the same story. And then we have power. So I don't know. I'm just putting that out there. Like, how do you feel about that in thinking about what you've written here?
It reminds me of Richard Rohr's Cosmic Egg. Have you heard of this?
Kelly will know it because she's like the biggest Rohr fan in the world.
You should describe it, because it's been a while since I've read or heard him talk about this.
The egg is it's like there's my story, our story, and the story. And so it's like the story is like the outer shell, like the thing that kind of holds us all together is the story. And then our story is what we share. And then there's that internalized, that what we were talking about with this other guy too, is just this idea that, kind of this split of thinking that we are our own individual person. And when we realize, oh no, it's not me, it's always an us. Right. And, yeah. And so when I think like what you're talking about, Aaron, too, is like, there's power there's a kind of dangerous power in the we too, right? In the us, when we're all kind of, jumping into the same story and then making the other group the other. But it's like, how do you get to I don't know, but then I'm going back to Abraham, and it's like, but it has to start somewhere, right?
I struggle a lot with this question. I mean, I go back and forth. I don't know if that's apparent from what I'm saying, but like I change my mind on this question all the time. Can someone be famous, for example, and is that ethical to be famous? Is it ethical to be influential because of your talent, or because of you've kind of hit on a trend, or because you're wealthy, or because, right? Like, I think there's sort of an uncomfortable reality where we can't actually, because we all collectively share so much and we are social beings, there is a reality there where you're going, okay, you kind of can't avoid some version of collective power or narrative. And I don't think we should. But then kind of how do you relate to each other within that? If you disagree, if you hold different narratives, right? So you kind of end up there where you're going, how do they respond to disagreement? I think this is one of the things I have found that has helped me make peace with even going to church again at all. Like, I'm in a PCUSA church at the moment. I'm not very involved, which is unusual for me based on my past history, where I was constantly getting coffee with the pastors to tell them my thoughts on things. You can imagine they loved that. But, what's made me kind of have at least some space for kind of the collective ritual of worship has been an acceptance of, there are certain spaces where disagreement is more welcome. There are spaces where we can be individuals still and collectively join together for certain purposes. I am a Democrat. I'm a registered Democrat. And part of that is because I do believe in a collective voice, a collective narrative. Do I tie myself to any of these things tightly? Absolutely not. I think the reality is, this is a deep human question. Like, what level of power should we have as individuals, as collective groups? How does that mean we relate to each other? We're dealing in the United States right now with a tribalism that is so intense, that it makes it even hard to be around people who believe differently than we do.
Yeah. I think more so than we've ever had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to like McCarthyism levels or something, I think, the fact is, I think I believe in a sort of equity at the base of the universe, which wouldn't be obvious because of me being Christian, but I think I am starting to believe that hierarchy is fictional. No person is actually more important than another person, just as a human, in our ontology, who we are. And I think when we set up these false hierarchies, we actually harm each other, including ourselves. And I would say, so what I see in Genesis, and this actually, to me, felt very radical, to see kind of the space that God gives to humans to reject God's plan, to push back on God's plan or God's actions. One of the most interesting passages to me was the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham, God is saying, I'm going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. I might destroy it because I'm hearing this outcry from the city that all this evil is happening here. And that outcry, by the way, is sort of a feminine outcry, sort of in the original language. And so God is hearing from the women of the city, there's something happening here that is deeply evil and unjust. And so God comes to examine the city and see kind of, are there any righteous people here? And Abraham has this back and forth dialogue, which is this very philosophical, well, what if there are 50 people in the city who are righteous? What about, 30? What about 15? What about 5? And rather than kind of strike down Abraham for his insolence or for rejecting God's authority or for whatever, God allows the whole exchange, which is, just fascinating. And then, I think one of the things that I've been thinking on is this question of, the last book of the Bible is Revelation. It's this book of judgment, basically, where kind of Jesus comes back in glory and conquers all evil and blah, 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 right? But then there's this passage where it talks about Jesus coming back and Jesus is standing at the door and knocking. And that's like the end of time. That's supposed to be the moment where, there's the brimstone and fireball from heaven that destroys the unfaithful. And instead, what we see is like the deity is knocking and waiting for a response. And so I think for one of the things that's been really meaningful is to realize kind of the authoritarianism that we bring to our reading of the Bible, to our institutional religious spaces, that does not seem to exist in the Bible as I read it. And I admit that there are people who read it differently than I do. I personally disagree with them. But I think it's been important for me to kind of make sense of that aspect of God, to say, is God authoritarian? Is God this Old Testament picture of judgment like the Michelangelo fresco. Does God really not care what happens? Does God actually send down the fire? God self, and so I think reckoning with that for me has been realizing that God actually gives us more space to be individuals, to think for ourselves, to make our own decisions than often we expect or experience within religious settings.
Almost like an open relational God.
Yeah.
I know you were on Jonathan Foster's podcast. Yeah. That there's a give and take, and there the passages where, God hears our cries and that we influence God as well. Yeah.
What do you, so is the knock, like when you were talking about is the knock at the sky, is that the knock at the door? Okay.
It wasn't in my mind probably explicitly, but I do think about that passage constantly. So it was probably there somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think the passage I've thought about a lot is the ask, seek, knock formula. Ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. So I view it more as even our action. The title to me is more about like us, we knock.
I see. Yeah.
What
do you hope that people who read it, like, what do you hope for them, for that process of what do you hope they take away from the book?
I hope that they feel permission to ask hard questions, and also to be creative with these stories. I think I had to kind of realize for myself that I have ownership over these stories. They don't belong to conservatives. They don't belong to evangelicals. They don't even belong to my culture and time. There is an openness to art, sort of a libertarianism, if you will. It's like, it really is a free for all. When you come to a work of art that has endured like the Bible has, like the book of Genesis has, you're able to bring so much and take so much from the text. And really it's hard to kind of, I think one of the things that's been hard is to see the way that Christianity has reined in imagination about this text. My hope would be that people actually would create entirely new dialogues from this, that it wouldn't, like, I don't want ever to be a final word on anything. Please don't take my words like that. They're not the final word for myself. So don't make them that for you. I'm really aiming to give people a sense of spiritual autonomy and agency when they come to the Bible, which has so often been read through this authoritarian lens. Like there's like one way to read it. There's one story, the one interpretation, one voice. And that's just not true.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I had this, understanding, thought I was taking a Bible interp class, which I hadn't taken for 30 years. And it occurred to me 30 years later that if we're looking at the Bible like a piece of art, we are not concerned about the author's intentions, right? We're the artist's, primary motive. I mean, those things can be part of it, but that's not, we don't go to a painting and go, I wonder what Picasso really wanted me to know in this. It's like, it's about what am I bringing to it? What experience am I bringing to it? What do I see on this day as opposed to yesterday? And I think that the beauty of Scripture, after it's been weaponized so much against us, right? The beauty of it is that there's so much richness, and the way I can even say like that I still believe it's inspired, it's divinely inspired, is because when we come to it and we bring our whole selves to it, like as it is a piece of art, then we find these beautiful kind of hidden narratives and these messages that I think are completely intended, I would say, by God, but not necessarily intended by the original authors. And to me, that's just kind of astounding and inviting. So I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think there's an invitation anytime we encounter art.
Yeah.
It's inevitable that we bring ourselves to it. And I think it's a beautiful part of the process of interpreting and encountering art, is that we are, you kind of release art into the world and you lose control of it. And that's actually a really good thing.
Yeah. Well, Liz, I can't wait to read your book. And can you just kind of give us the information, like tell us I'm going to go on and pre-order it, but where people can get it, when it's coming out, and also maybe how to get in contact with you through your social media and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called Knock at the Sky: Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. It comes out first week of January 7th. And you can find me on Threads and Instagram and Facebook at Liz Charlotte Grant, just my name. Okay. And then my Substack is The Empathy List. So I'd love to see you there.
Yeah, I already subscribed. So you have one new subscriber today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz. This was great.
We really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
A huge thank you to our listeners. Our show just keeps growing, and that's because of you. Thank you for sharing the show with your friends, sending us your reactions, and suggesting new topics for us to explore.
We love hearing from our listeners. Get in touch with us at www.atheistpodcast.com and on our new Instagram page @atheistpodcast. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.